Worst trait, special skill, or quirks. Interesting. What are your worst traits?
あら、嫌なことを聞きますのね。
What's so awful about asking that?
Yeah.
Hey now, I was just curious. I think it's good to think about that sort of thing every now and then.
そうね。私、女にしては背が高すぎるんじゃないかと思うんですの。
Yeah, this is what I thought about. Like, that's privilege right there. That's what happens when you're too privileged. You can't see flaws, or you can't see things that you want to improve.
そっか。
Yeah, well, how tall are you anyway?
170ちょうどですわ。
170 centimeters is quite tall for me, anyways.
なるほど。
Like, compared to me. That is tall, but your body proportions are great, so I wouldn't worry. Maybe they're too good. You're like a model or an actress.
あら、本当に？お世辞が上手ね。
Smooth. No, I really mean it. I love walking next to a tall beauty like you. I don't know how tall Shinada is. I don't remember.
品田さんはご結婚されてませんの？
Imagine breaking out that question.
Yeah.
No, not yet.
それはどうしてですの？何か理由でも終わりなのかしら。
Why not, you ask?
したくてもできない方もいらっしゃるでしょ？お金がないとかそういう理由で。
I don't want to get...
さあね。
That's probably more true for Shinada. If there was someone I considered marrying, I'd already be married.
それじゃあ結婚する気はあるんですの？
あ、
Hey, I want to be happy just as much as the next guy. If someone likes me for who I am, I'd marry her for sure. We know. Shinada wants to give... He's open to marriage.
あら、なかなか情熱的ですのね。でも勢いで結婚するのは良くないと思いますわ。
It's low success to rush into a marriage, but it's not unheard of. So, for better or for worse, for good or bad, just the marriage can be appropriate regardless if it's rushed or not. Just gotta read the room. Yeah, but I've never been one to think stuff through.
私もそろそろ結婚考えたいところなんですけど、パートナーが見つからないですよね。
それじゃあ。
Lovers wanted, huh?
そうですね。でも男性の方からお声がかかるのを待っているというより、私の方から探しているといった感じなんですの。
That's a you problem, but fair enough.
私、自分に釣り合う男性とじゃないとお付き合いしたくありませんの。
That is also a you problem.
そっか。
Just don't rush it. You never know when you might meet that special someone. I'm sure the right guy will show up eventually. I wouldn't say that last line. I would be... If the circumstances meet, perhaps lowering your standards and all that other stuff can play a role. But based on what she just shared, incredibly unlikely that she'll probably be alone for quite some time. Wait, why did she share her height in centimeters? I assumed that they could use feet to cater to American people. That's true. This game has always been in the metric system. But in case you're wondering, American people do use the metric system. So, like, it's still very appropriate. They just use centimeter. They could include both. That would be an American thing. Like, that's a misconception. Like, like, for example, in a typical conversation, certainly we'll use feet. But when you're measuring something, you could use it's both in feet and centimeters, or like it's both metric and English. Like when you're gonna rattle off your exact height, but they could translate it. I would say that's definitely an arguable thing. But she's Japanese, so I think for RGG standards, going centimeters would communicate the correct Japanese thing. I don't think Japanese has an English unit thing. No, I don't think so. They do have a non-metric. They do have some non-metric units. Yeah, no, but I mean, she's Japanese. So RGG tends to stick with the portrayal of the character, right? And here's the catch. In Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, I have no qualms thinking that they're going to talk in the non-metric system every once in a while. If height and stuff comes up. So we'll see. I'm kind of excited. I'm really excited because culturally, even measuring systems and whatnot have different perspectives. But generally speaking, like the reason why I say this is because it's very rare nowadays, or at least for myself, to not see in both. In both the systems. And as a person that is multicultural, right? Knowing only one system means you are less skilled. That's just it. So I think in general it would be kind of cool for them to include both. But yeah, 170 centimeters, that's kind of tall, but I don't know how long. I mean, how long? I don't know how tall Shinada is though. She might be taller than Shinada.
そんなにのんびり待ってたらおばあさんになってしまいますわ。
There are some fun stuff about having two measuring systems. There are certain things that there are very specific cases where they people use measurements the way I use measurements most of the time, and that's when it's most appropriate. So for example, 170 centimeters is knowing 3 digits more complicated than knowing 2 digits, or is a round number easily more memorable than a non-round number, or an integer is better than a fractional number. So for example, for me, in terms of height, I often use centimeters because feet and inches are 2 units, and you have to convert 2 units within the same unit. So just using centimeters is, I prefer to remember 3-digit measurements than 2-unit single digits, but sometimes triple digits. So like 5 feet 11 inches, right? That's 3 digits and 2 units to remember. So I go generally the more convenient route and just remember one number with 1 unit. Another great example is going between degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit, depending on what you're talking about. And actually Americans do go between those two quite conveniently because it's easier to remember 0 degrees Celsius and 100 degrees Celsius significance than 292 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. And then it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit for freezing. I really don't know the boiling temp in Fahrenheit. It's like 290 or something like that. It's a really number that's difficult to remember. But 32 degrees, I happen to know 32 degrees Fahrenheit But generally, I would use 0 degrees Celsius. So when you talk to an American, a lot of times the phrase is below 0, right? It's like, oh yeah, it's freezing. It's below 0. I think often it's misunderstood or it's not quite clear when people talk about, they're talking about being freezing, which is below 0 degrees Celsius. But sometimes in the extreme case, no, they actually use below 0. Sub-zero, if you're talking about Fahrenheit, it's not 0 yet. When you go into sub-zero, a lot, and I was just about to get to that actually. It's out of convenience. So when it gets really, really cold, and they say it's freezing and it's sub-zero temperatures, they typically are referring to the Fahrenheit scale, which is really cold. It's sub-zero cold. But when it's below 0, they're often just talking about freezing. So that's below 0 degrees Celsius, which is less cold than sub-zero. Yeah, so that creates the confusion, right? Like, oh no, now we're all confused. It's like, yeah, because you have to know more things. When you have to know more things, you have to be a little bit more smart, right? So we all, typically, the hot take here is, you know more systems, but typically it gets more complicated because you only know the systems out of convenience. What is the major argument against the English system? Metric system is easier overall. It's like, well, it's only easier because you only use that system. So in order to bridge, if you're an intellectual and you want to be mutually respectful in an intellectual conversation, you have to understand that if you're using a system and you're always using that system, it is always going to be easier than a system you don't use. But it doesn't make you smarter. Using more systems actually make you smarter. But it gets harder. Harder things make you smarter, not easier things. So effectively, what I'm saying is I actually do the stupid thing. I do the easier thing. I choose numbers that are easier to remember. And it makes it harder for me to remember the more information. It actually makes it worse. I train less in understanding what the boiling temperature of Fahrenheit is, because I choose to make the easier choice, which is 100 degrees Celsius. So whenever you're cooking, like you're really skilled at cooking and stuff, I only talk in Celsius because I'm incapable and too lazy to understand what it is in Fahrenheit. The thing I do, though, that I still do, is I can at least convert them. The relationship, like the equation, right? The equation relationship between Celsius and Fahrenheit, I guesstimate based on that. The same way I do the centimeters to the feet and inches. In fact, I'm so lazy most of the time, I just remember how many inches. I don't even bother with feet. Because when I'm talking to someone, they can easily convert the inches to feet. Because I equate inches to centimeters so that the inches and centimeters are relatively the same number of digits. And I have to convert it to feet when someone wants it in feet. So I'm getting more efficient at doing things, but it makes you dumber. Like what I mean by dumber is it makes you very more specific. You end up learning less over time, and that's fair. Like but the irony here is the weirdest contrast here psychologically is that using the metric system is the smart way of doing things. It's the efficient way of doing things. Is it correct way of doing things? And I mean, correct is subjective. So it's okay to say something like 82 inches, and so yeah, I prefer. I can imagine 82 inches. 6 feet. I can imagine that too, but I prefer. Well, no. But you picked an even number, right? I'm gonna tell you now. Most people don't round to the nearest feet. So you literally picked the thing that most people won't have. They would probably say like 6 feet 1 inch, and I would prefer them to just say 83 inches, if you know what I mean, so that you don't have to worry about how many inches are in a feet and how many feet are in inches. Like, you don't have to convert multiple times. So if you say 83 inches, it's simpler than saying 6 feet and 1 inch to me personally. And that's kind of like centimeters. You don't tell someone in, like, the nice thing about the metric system is you don't break it up into two forms of measure, right? Like, for example, you could choose to say 17.0 decimeters if you wanted. Wait, is it decimeter? It's decimeter, right? Hold up. That hold up. You see, that's what I mean by yeah. But it's decimeter, yeah. Yeah, so this is what I mean by you get dumber. Like, you get less knowledge over time. You practice less things. And so, yes, it's an unnecessary extra layer, but it's also practicing something extra. Now, you might think, why do you feel like it's unnecessary? It's because there isn't a task requiring of it yet. Now, let's frame it differently. Let's put some more perspective on it. If you're talking to an American, it becomes a necessary extra layer. And because you didn't practice what you think was unnecessary, you are literally less charismatic and less worldly, less cultured to an American. You see what I mean? Like, what I mean is it's unnecessary now, but I'm telling you that my flaw is I'm lazy. My flaw is I like to be efficient, because ultimately things are unnecessary based on what I think is necessary. But the thing that makes someone really worldly, if you consider yourself an intellectual and you're like very cultured, you're constantly thinking it's always necessary to learn more instead of losing that information. So now I can't, like, now I have problems, that I wouldn't normally have if I went through the extra effort, right? So it comes down to, in the end, the true intellectual would be enamored by the extra steps, because the extra steps practices things that you don't know you need yet. It goes the same with conversationalism. It's like the conversing thing. A lot of people say things like, what's the point of apologizing? Or what's the point of being indirect? Like, to me, if you be direct, that's the only way you should speak all the time. It's like, what if your boss, the guy paying your paycheck, the billionaire that wants to hire you, is an indirect person? Well, I go find another job. It's like, you got it. See ya. But it also means that you lack the skill to talk to someone that's indirect. It's the same as trying to understand the Japanese culture from an American perspective. It's the same as anyone who's talking outside of the thing. It's unnecessary. So you don't practice that skill. And you will be unskilled at it. And that's kind of like a bigger arching digression. And I feel yesterday's digression about talking the talk and walking the walk, there's so much emphasis on walking the walk that talking the talk is an unnecessary extra step. You've heard this before. It's like, oh yeah, don't worry about telling me this. And I've done this too. Is people like, you don't have to tell me you're nice, just show me you're nice. What does that do? Well, in the future, when you can't show someone that you're nice, you won't be able to tell them and convince them that you're nice. You no longer have that skill. You did not practice it. You don't think it's necessary anymore. My biggest gripe to that, and I do this sometimes too, and to me, it's like the American culture that's speaking out of me. It's kind of like a Freudian slip, if you believe in Freudian psychology, where I would say, I would de-emphasize the need to be able to explain something. So, for example, oh man, that guy's acting really nice. They must be nice. It's like, well, if they're acting nice, do they know why they're nice? Like, are they processing why they're nice? Because in order to explain that to someone, you have to be able to speak it in the first place. So if they're so reliant on showing something, they can't possibly explain it very well because they're spending more time showing it. A great example is a really good gamer, and this really good gamer wants to help his or her friends, you know, etc., get better at the game. They spend more time practicing the game than talking about the game. A person who spends more time talking about the game is more likely to be successful even though they're worse at the game, literally. And that's the differentiation between the teacher and a practitioner. And here's another big thing, and I'm gonna be more of an American bent to this. The idea that a teacher is someone who wasn't good enough to make it versus a professional who made it. But guess what? No one is focusing on the idea that the professional sucks at teaching because they don't spend time teaching. They spend the time performing. If you take the same person and clone them, and they decide to spend disproportionate amount of time explaining things and talking the talk instead of walking the walk, they will be better at talking the talk than walking the walk. So now we're not even comparing two different people. We're talking about the same person who choose two different paths. And in this landscape, and still today, there's an emphasis on the value of a performer over the value of someone who's passing on knowledge. And I say it that way because teacher tends to be like referring to school and stuff, but it's not just school, it's any skill. It's a craftsman teaching their pupil. It's a master martial artist instructing, you know, their new class. It's a stranger consoling someone who's depressed. You can be depressed, you can form thick skin, you can recover from depression. It doesn't make you a great therapist. I'm just saying, like, there's a difference between someone who recovers from depression and has a skill practicing helping people with depression. I mean, it's one of those things like it's really counterintuitive, but when someone solves a problem and you see that they solve the problem, it doesn't make them an expert at solving that problem. You have to be aware if they are committed to practicing how to explain that. Without that skill, you're barking up a tree that won't give you an adequate response. I was trying to get to the perspective you were describing. I wouldn't even think about it because 6 feet 1 inch doesn't feel like an extra layer to me. Not sure how I process that though. Haven't really. Yeah, it's 2 units. Don't know much about France. I think I remember something about it. Didn't really study him. The what? That was too. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I don't know when that was it. I think it was dealing with Sub-Zero? No, it wasn't my comment with Sub-Zero, right? Yeah, well, in the end, like, if I had to refocus, it just comes down to, like, how much you're willing to remember, right? I don't really... I say there are many things I cut corners with, and I no longer am good at them. Like, or even decent at them. And one of them is definitely measurements. Like, how many fluid ounces are in a bottle? And this is made worse because bottles are different sizes. Yeah, so am I good at math? That's a weird question that I haven't considered. What do you mean by good at math? Like, how do you measure it? That's a genuine question. I'm not entirely sure. Are you talking about mathematical concepts? Like abstraction of math? Because if you're talking about grades, the answer is yes. Like how comfortable you're using abstract models and applying them, yeah. That would be pretty on point. Because abstraction of like that is how I view the universe. Like I use mathematical models as a way to view the universe. So like for example, playing video games deal with mathematical models. Whether they're rudimentary or not, typically when you're thinking about game theory and stuff, you're using abstraction of models, like the probabilistic states and stuff. So whenever I'm talking about like, how do I improve something, I'm thinking of it from a mathematical perspective, most of the time. Likelihoods, you know, combinations, permutations. When you're thinking about dialogue webs, I'm thinking about how many permutations the dialogue webs have. When I'm thinking about completing Yakuza 5, what is the highest statistical probability of lining up certain events so that I do that instead? It creates a lifestyle that increases efficiency. It doesn't really make you more cultured, but it does increase your efficiency. Being good at math is that impression. So we're not talking about someone who remembers all the digits of pi. That's memorization. And we're not talking about people who can present an operation very rapidly, like add numbers rapidly, multiply very large numbers, create the operations of, I don't know, like what's 3,937 divided by 6, and then you have all these shortcuts to make yourself efficient on creating that operation. Instead, it's more like, how would you view the distribution of Japanese opinions based on converging evidence of their perspective on Americans' layback culture. So where you start? Well, first you need some sampling here, and then how does that weigh the distribution, right? Like you're asking like, well, how much sample size do you need to offer convincing evidence, right? And you can still abstract that even further, like to conversations. How many affirmative responses do you need in a line of inquiry to feel compelled to agree with someone? Or what is the statistical likelihood that you say 3 things negative and then follow up of a positive? Like how frequent is that successful in a line of questioning? Or there are many ways to abstractly view the world mathematically, that kind of thing. Like the rules of 3, the propensity of 7 objects. There's so many things. It's such a deep cut, but I do like to view the world in mathematical terms. It helps me grasp things. It allows me to control things a lot more. Yes, calculation speed is iteration. So like the calculation thing, but we have to keep in mind that the vast majority of people, whether normalized or intuitively or naively, equate speed to aptitude. Like abstraction is independent of speed. Abstraction has no standardized things. Abstraction is a higher level cognitive function, right? Speed tends to be the repetition of something that doesn't require higher level function. It is so optimized that it becomes automated, right? It becomes reproducible and consistent. Abstraction is not quite consistent. When you apply an abstract model mathematically to another person's abstract model of the same phenomena, it's going to be slightly different. So, the downside of where I'm going is I don't necessarily say that I am good at math. I'm good at abstraction. And abstraction includes mathematical models. So for someone to be genuinely great at hard, I'm going to put in really big quotes, hard concepts, the hardness comes from abstraction. Because one thing that humans are blessed with, in my opinion, they are blessed with the ability of abstraction. It's the highest level of complexity that a human being can express. And many of the stuff that are hard to reproduce consistently are the last frontiers for like things like AI and stuff, right? Art, music, subjective things. With a big asterisk on subjective things, they have to be abstracted subjective things. So for example, if you say you like the way this lady looks, right? If you like the way this lady looks, can you abstractly convince someone why this lady looks good? If you don't do that, then you're superficially at the gym and not the school moment. You're at the gym. Because what you're doing is you're saying this lady looks nice because that's what you've been doing for the most of your life. Like, this looks nice. This looks not so great. This looks all right. And that's talking the talk. I'm going to go whip it back to yesterday's digression. That's talking the talk. You are relying on intuition. And intuition is also a great human condition. Because it's easy, it's efficient, it's very fast, and also humans are great at intuition. So it cuts a lot of corners. But the moment I ask you, what is the quality breakdown in abstraction of the word like that qualifies this face being pleasing to you? What is the sample size you need? So here comes the math again. How many sample size of faces of character models with this graphical engine or the extent of this developer's stylistic choice do you need to convince yourself to create a model in which you can accurately predict that you'll like the face? So for example, with the understanding of the abstraction of your subjective evaluation of this face, can you produce an ideal face, theoretically, to your eyes? And that's kind of what AI and like people in the arts, but also have a great abstraction, is thinking about. And there are careers that involve that. An underappreciated career is advertisement. There is a huge gap between people who are just mediocre at advertisement, and then there are incredible people at advertisement. There's a reason why YouTube, Google, and Apple and stuff it's not just necessarily the literal hardware. It's understanding psychology in an abstracted, almost mathematical way. Business itself is an abstraction of mathematics and psychology. It's an integration between those two. And we're kind of at like a bleeding edge with automated processes like AI and machine learning to produce products that would inherently take advantage of all these like interconnected variables. I've just lost my train of thought, but in the end of the day, it comes down to I don't want to detract from just math, but I think being good at math, the abstraction of math, is a telltale sign of a person who's probably good at a lot of things. And what I mean by good at a lot of things, good at a lot of abstracting things, like critical thinking is one of the skills that I would say is lower than abstraction. So abstraction is the king. And below it, there are various skills that are largely common to people who don't have a lot of problems that they can't solve. And one of the properties is critical thinking. If critical thinking is whatever it is, right? It's abstract. It's an abstract concept. Like, how good is someone's critical thinking? It's very abstract. It's very hard to quantify. So it's one of those nebulous things where, if you're a teacher, your greatest goal, in my opinion, my end game, if I was a teacher, is to imbue each student with the ability to maximize their critical thinking. If they can somehow demonstrate that to me, and it's really hard to conceptualize, like, how do I measure a student's level of critical thinking? I don't. I try as much as I can within the year I have them in my class to test as many things as I can to gauge their critical thinking. And if it's satisfactory, I know, to me, that with that critical thinking skills, they have the capacity to learn and solve problems, regardless of the difficulty of the task. I wonder if there's a correlation between being good at abstract thinking and being good at video games, for example, or is it similar to being street smart, rather? Ooh, that's a tough one. I thought about it before. Actually, this was in college, like I have to like think of how many years ago. 2010, 13 years ago. For psychology, I thought about looking into that, but there was not enough, like, you can't data mine those things 12 years ago. But it would be interesting. It's a thing you can probably get depending on how much information you can like gather, right? Unless you're privileged to that, you can probably draw some pretty strong corollary studies between the level of aptitude in abstract thinking, because there's a lot of models to test the degree of someone's abstract thinking, and then you can there is a lot of tracked data on video games that they would or not play, right? Like you can gather some gross data. It's video game data is tracked all the time, but you would have to see if you can get enough data from their aptitude. So how do you measure abstract thinking? Often you can gather a bunch of converging evidence. One would be like their educational background would be a converging evidence. How they scored in school, that might be available, I don't know. Or the easiest access would be their highest level of education. You can use that as a variable. And then IQ tests, you could get them to maybe do a voluntary IQ test where they have done a voluntary IQ test. You could even do a personality test that doesn't seem like it's measuring abstract thinking, but what you're trying to do is you're piling up as many variables as possible to measure abstract thinking. Then you can probably pit it against as much video game data you can get from them, and maybe you can glean something. But that all has to feed into some. I wouldn't do it manually. I would probably get it to bootstrap somehow. You probably have to reduce all the variables into brackets, like bin them, basically bin them on qualifications, then further bin them into like single language so that you can just like get like a, I don't know, program a JavaScript or Java to just run loops through them. But even if that correlates, there's so much nuance, it could probably take a decade to. Well, it is. Oh, well, actually, the thing is, the idea that you're talking about is not something that isn't being done. And what I mean by that is, it's not decades. It's not a decade. It's like technology. These questions have existed for a really long time, like a very long time, in some way, shape, or form. Like the what we're trying to get out of it, like the answer, like the meaning of the study, is been around for a while. And yeah, it could be worth. It's, yeah, I mean, for most parts, if you're asking someone like me, it's always worth. There are very few things, because knowledge. This is such a cliche, but knowledge is power, whether it's necessary or not necessary. The downside to that is you don't know its value, and you may never live. You may end up not living long enough to see the value in the information. So worthiness, like how much is worth, is often measured by someone's lifetime. But generally speaking, when it comes to really big scale questions that you want to answer, you're thinking about something beyond your lifetime, beyond your perspective. So it's difficult to measure worth when you're at a level of abstraction. That's what I would describe basic science. Basic science is about being as diligent and all-encompassing in terms of your ability to capture information. But that information is inherently, in good faith, worth something at some point, at some time that you may never witness. Like there's a chance you'll never see it. You'll never see the application of anything you've discovered. It goes beyond your lifetime. And generally speaking, that's probably more the norm than the like the reality. As in, if you're a basic researcher, you probably have inadvertently noted, discovered, and quantified more information that doesn't have value than it does for your lifetime, because your perspective and your scope can't go beyond your lifetime. And that's the crux of science, in my opinion. That's the diminished return in it's one of like a super unfortunate poeticness of science in general. You do not live long enough often to see what you have contributed if you are to go in that route. And these questions that you ask, they would likely have been started by people well before our time. Like these questions have probably been asked over and over again every new generation, because it's iterative. Like, oh, now can we tell if abstract thinking is linked to the enjoyment of abstraction in video games, right? And all that, like it probably iterated even before video games, like when you're playing games before video games, when you're solving puzzles before puzzles were turned into a conception of a video game. And that's really cool if you think about it. It also makes it feel, sometimes if you're like a person who's asking these questions and trying to solve these questions, it does make you feel very small. And that can create nihilism. And nihilism is a very dangerous thing to a human's health, especially mental state. You make it feel like, man, I would love to know the answers to these things, but I probably would never find the answer ever again. So that's what you illustrated there, where like it would probably have too much nuances that it'll probably take decades to sort out a significant conclusion. And typically corollary studies, I'm gonna say most conclusions are significant, whether we know it or not. The idea that a conclusion can be inaccurate is information you can use to inform something else. So the inaccurateness of a conclusion can inform on how little we know or what we don't know about the conclusion that it was made. So it's still informative. So when it comes to significance, since we can't know whether it's necessary or unnecessary, you operate on the idea that whatever you learn is significant, even if you can't appreciate it yet. And that's abstract thinking, in my opinion. Like, if you are constantly thinking about the pragmatic application of what you're learning now, you are less likely to be an abstract thinker. Abstract thinkers tend to not necessarily conform themselves to what they know. It's more about thinking about what it could be. Like, I'm gonna record this because I don't know it yet, but maybe I'll have an idea down the line that will be useful. So that type of thing encourages the person to constantly learn more. Like, it's never like, I don't like this, it's not worth my time. It's, I can probably make it worth my time. So in terms of like personality, like when I talked about the whole personality trait and stuff, there's a higher, and there are some correlations when it comes to like personality traits and the type of thinker they are. And that's kind of one of them, like one of the behavioral aspects. When someone thinks about how useful it can be now versus how you can make it useful anytime. So why am I having this conversation now? Often you would say, a pragmatist would say, I'm having this conversation now because I'm addressing a problem I have right now. Add a extra layer. An abstract thinker would be someone like, okay, I'm going to solve this problem now by talking about this, right? As best as I can. But what other purpose, what other things could I possibly turn this into for later? So a good an example is I'm very socially anxious. I mean, I could get a job that doesn't involve talking. That solves my problem. It's like, well, yes, pragmatically speaking, it will solve your problem if you have social anxiety talking to someone and you just get a job that avoids it. But what if you didn't and you learned how to talk? Is it only because it's not worth it because there's an option to avoid it? Or can you use it in a way that it doesn't create social anxiousness? Is it not worth because you're only socially anxious now? That's abstraction. Because you can't see what's going to happen. But you're operating on the idea that it can happen or it could happen. So you're always motivated to do the thing. And then that's kind of bleeds into like street smarts versus book smart. I personally do not. I think that's a little bit archaic now too. As in like, it used to be that street smarts mean doing, like walking the walk again. It's about walking the walk. The more experience you have, the more intelligent, like their experience can trump book smarts. But in the end of the day, an abstract thinker would say both. You have to do things that maximize both your experience and taking advantage of that experience theoretically. So for me, it's been a really long time since someone has ever asked me, is it worth doing something? And I say, no, it's not. Because I spend most of my time thinking how it can be worth. Not how it is now. Like, what I mean is, if someone told me, you should learn how to ride a bike. And I'm like, well, I have no use for a bike right now. So the obvious pragmatic answer would be, it's not worth. It's like, well, how can I make it worth? It's like, are you going to ride a bike? You're going to ride a bike. Okay, well, yeah, that's a good condition for me to make it worth. So yeah, it is definitely worth. But I don't have to tell that person that. I don't have to tell the person like, oh, you're the reason I ride a bike. I just made it so that it's worth to me. I can abstractly think of things that'll make me do anything. But the idea is there's a danger to that, right? So it's not like I'm not always doing that. Because there's pragmatism. When you become pragmatic, you become more objective. You don't end up fully being like, oh well, if it's always worth, then it's always worth skydiving. It's always worth risking your life. Like, well then, yeah. So I think there still is a balance. Like, I don't think abstract thinking is like the king, like where you always have to look on a bright side. You can always think outside of a box. You have to think inside the box too. So it's kind of ironic, but I don't think it takes an abstract thinker necessarily to think that the more things you do, the more dynamic you become. The trade-off is the more things you do, the more conflicted you become. It becomes overwhelming after a point. So pragmatism, being pragmatic and being efficient, is the counter to that, is to reduce the volume to a manageable state. If you, one of the other hallmarks of a healthy individual is being able to juggle your sensory overload, like being overwhelmed. So even the greatest minds, right, struggle with managing what's going through their mind. It's I often call that mania. Mania leads to depression. Basically, some of the most brilliant minds ever to grace human history often feels unaccomplished by the time they die. Like, by the time they pass, they know that there's just so much more, but it's the regulation of that. I don't know if it's a you could say there was a biological driver or a conditioning or like social pressure for them to perform, but ultimately being able to regulate that is great. So to me, I'm not saying don't focus on being a straightforward thinker. There's a time and place, and it helps you maintain semblance of control. So there's great wonderfulness in doing things you know you can do very rapidly and very well. There's also the benefits, like pros and cons, right? So going all the way back to where this started, I don't even know how we oh, it started with SI units. I'm gonna here's the hot take. Whenever we talk about units, perspective, cultural differences, I think of everything I just said. Every single time. Like almost every single time. It's so difficult for me to not go down this line of thinking. So when someone tells me that this is the right way, my immediate thought past all these is that I hope the wrong way doesn't come up for them. That's my thought. Like, I'm usually thinking of all the possibilities where this person can succeed, as opposed to all the possibilities where this person can fail, usually, because I'm more like a positive forward person. But that also means I'm not great at looking at the worst case scenarios. But when someone says, I only do this, my only concern is what else they didn't do, or what they didn't consider, because I'm looking out for that. I don't have to assure you. Like, I trust you. I trust people when they say, I'm really good at this. It's like, okay, I trust you. Now I hope that whatever you're good at, you're not sacrificing something you're not good at, and it becomes a problem. So when someone says, oh yeah, you know, us in the real world use the metric system, my first thought is, good luck on a platform dominated by Americans. It might not be true for the soon, right? Like, it could change for absolute, but right now, statistically, the likelihood of you entering a conversation, a conflict about the metric system is relatively high. And to me, I hope your life does not struggle with that. I hope your self-esteem and your impression of the internet is not marred by the highly statistical likelihood that you will enter a non-verbal confrontation with someone else. So when I mean non-verbal, I mean when someone makes that comment, they themselves do not know that they might have alienated all their opportunities to get to know the American culture. For better or for worse, my likelihood is I hope you stay in your country, right? A place where you don't have to use that skill at all and flourish and succeed. But if you're on the internet and you're on an American platform, right? The idea is, I like to point these out to you. Like, I hope that you don't get upset when you feel like you're getting ganged up on, because you're on an American platform. And that's kind of the thing. Like I don't like seeing people being upset. And a lot of times they're upset because they're placing themselves in a situation that they couldn't have imagined that makes it appropriate for the skill that they thought was not worth. I mean, I just got disappointed 2 days ago with an acquaintance of mine who said that there's no merit to playing video games that deal with dating. Like, to me, I hold it very true that that's super telling about that person. And I hope, like, they know that these things serve a lot of merit. Like, there's a lot of things you can gather from it. But I hope that's not the thing that they're insufficient in. I know I'm using the hope word a lot because now I'm dealing with probability. So is this conversation worth having? To me, it's worth having. Like, the value is created by your ability to abstractly think how valuable it can be. And because you yourself can't live long enough to see all the possibilities. So one day, you're gonna end up like me, where every time you play a video game, you have something to say about that moment. Like, I'm crafting stories. I'm remembering stories because I make them important to me. So like, this moment, I'm going to remember this character Xion because we're gonna have this conversation. And that's kind of the thing. Like, superficially, you could always just write it off. It's really exhausting. So you have to gauge how often you want to do it. But if you always feel like... I like this part. Here's one of the GOAT things that I feel like it's a bit counterintuitive. I live by this personally, but I don't know if it's true for a lot of people who have perhaps a bit of compulsive disorder, like, or maybe a strong compulsion. But you're a great thinker, in my opinion, when one day you have so much to say about something that you don't need to feel the need to say it. Now, this is a little bit different from the negative spin on this thing, where if you don't know, don't open your mouth and prove that, right? Like that's usually the euphemism. Like, oh yeah, like, you can't know everything, so always be on the safe side and think before you speak. But here's the GOAT about something. A lot of times, people who have a lot to say tend to want to say it, but there's like an end game to it, in my opinion. Sometimes you can get to a point where you know so much about the thing, you get very comfortable in not saying anything at all. But you know enough that you say, I will have something to say about this. So if anyone wants to talk to me about something, I feel very confident, like that confidence in knowing that I have something to say about it makes you feel very comfortable with any topic. So when it comes to like things like, are you good at math? Well, I don't need to know that I'm good at math. I can at least talk about math enough to give someone impression that I'm competent in math. That's all. That's all that's necessary, in my opinion. And I'm making it sound simple, but that's also acknowledging that I've been in this kind of state of mind for a really long time. So it's hard for me sometimes to imagine it being difficult anymore. So when someone asks me a question, I can choose to give them the long version, the short version, but I at least know that I'm confident enough that I've thought about this enough, like the abstraction, right? Enough that it's, yeah, you don't really need to say anything. That's interesting because I thought of it as a personality trait rather than something that correlates with how much you have to say on the discussed topic. The insecurity, the need, the compulsory to, the compulsory to chime in or not chime in on things and talk about things. Yeah, that's fair. For a while, I compartmentalized those things. So like personality traits, what they can do, knowledge of the topic, and then like it's nice to like compartmentalize them, but in the end of the day, you have to put them back together. So how much of our personality traits enable us to know things about a discussed topic? So instead of thinking, what kind of personality traits? Being more observant. Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Let's just say, yeah, this is gonna be our digression for today, but let's just say if we can break them apart. Let's see if we can break them apart, right? I can't really do that, so I'm gonna try to make a compelling case how they're connected instead. So since we are human being, and we are pretty, I think with some practice you can compartmentalize things pretty easily. But one of the things is, can you truly compartmentalize personality traits from any of your motivations? Because at the core, your inherent nature to know, say, participate, or observe is pivotal and resting on motivation. Like the need, like the desire to observe anything or to do anything. Like at the very top, curiosity is probably at the top, but I would say motivation is probably above curiosity. The motivation to do anything, the motivation to be curious. All those you could say are personality traits. So say like a personality trait is actually, I don't think that's a personality trait. Most of the time it's like what do they say? Like intellect. I have no idea anymore, like what the popular personality traits, but I'm thinking above it. So what I'm saying is I'm generalizing even more, I guess, and it's a dangerous thing to do, but I'm thinking of the thing that connects most of them as opposed to what separates them. So personality traits tend to be exclusive things. Like, here are the 5 things that do not overlap with each other that composes a human being. But what I'm thinking of is what to maximize those personality traits. What is the one thing that connects all of them? So one of them is motivation. Like, how do you get yourself to be motivated irregardless of your personality trait? So the personality trait that we're thinking of is how to get yourself involved, right? Is that a personality trait? Like, is motivation a personality trait? I think most of the things motivation feeds into most of the personality traits. So like, if you're really observant, you're motivated to be observant. How do you motivate yourself to be observant? You have different personalities. How do you motivate the different personalities to be observant? So for me, I do abstract thinking. Like, I figure out, like, for me, banking information makes me feel safe. Maybe someone else is like, I don't need to know a lot of things. It makes me nervous. So how do you maximize that? How do you motivate the person to learn when they're in that state? So that's kind of like what I'm saying is that personality traits tend to be independent of what I'm saying. but it can correlate to how much people want to say on the discuss. It's really, I'm like ranting now because it's too complicated for me to understand. I boil it down to something simpler because I can't understand it. So I don't understand, like, for example, one of the weaknesses of what I'm saying is I do not understand how personality traits correlate to how much someone, how observant someone is, for example, because it's too complicated. So instead, I decide what can motivate someone to be observant. And then that someone has different properties. Is my motivation applicable to enough people? And then I say those things. So one thing I can say about that thought is that if you can find value in most situations, you are likely to be observant, irregardless of your personality trait. Everybody is going to independently have personality traits, but if they have the ability to find value, you know, like them, the person with the differing personality, find value, they will naturally and inherently be observant. So does that mean that the personality trait is correlated to observations? Probably to some extent, because the process of how they can get themselves to find value in it is probably dependent on their personality traits. So, but that means that being observant isn't necessarily bound by personality. There's personality, the process of acquiring value, then leads to observance. So you can like fill in the gaps. Like there's a leap of logic, right? And correlation is that. Correlation is not causation because often it deals with a leap of logic. You're making an assumption that people with specific personalities use certain methods in order to become observant or motivated to do something. So I'm simply trying to answer the closest upstream thing because I can't understand how personalities work. Like, it's so far removed from something. So in this case, we can take it back to the metric system. Right, we can kind of take it back to the metric system. Does it require a specific type of personality to want to know both the English unit or the metric system, right? You can make an argument that a personality that is focused on pragmatism, like knowing the least possible things in order to do all the things they want, would favor the metric system, regardless of other things like cultural normalization and all that stuff. They would pick the most efficient. That kind of turns into chicken or the egg if you put it together with a correlation. Yeah, it's too black and white. Yeah. So the chicken or the egg, that's kind of nihilism too, where like you can never know what the beginning is. What we can observe though is a correlation that's already happening. So for example, instead of concerning about how you shape the personality, you know that this person's personality came before a task. Like for example, there are things like how do we get someone to learn something new? Right? That's a situation that doesn't require the chicken or the egg thing. How do you get something to learn something new? Well, you don't know the context of whatever that new thing is. So that's what I'm kind of focused on. Like the walk the walk, talk the talk, and the metric system is how do you get someone to learn something that they cannot see a purpose for? That deals with nothing about black and white. because you don't know what the thing is. You don't know what the future holds. So how do you get someone excited about knowing something with maybe no potential at all? And I think that to me is like the GOAT in this. If you can able, and I honestly think to tie this in, it deals with abstract thinkers. Abstract thinkers tend to try to go beyond what's in front of them. And it is, I'm going to say, it's almost dangerously addictive. It's dangerously uncontrolled. It's mania when it's uncontrolled. So when you ask me, am I good at math? The only way I can control my mania is to ask someone else who is not an abstract thinker. Because we could be talking about it for like ever. Like it would spiral. But thankfully, and I rely a lot on the person asking the question because they provide the box that I can operate in. And even then, I still spiraled off into other discussions and whatnot. But that's kind of how I do it. In order to also remove the chicken or the egg thing. Because, like, the chicken is you, worm. I mean, like, it depends on who. Oh, man, that's kind of a rough analog. Like, it's easier to envision the egg being the container. But what I'm saying is you're offering all the conditions, right? So, to me, if you find yourself doing that most of the time, it becomes very obvious that you're the abstract thinker. So, for example, if someone asks you a full-blown question, what's your favorite Like a Dragon game? My first question would be, can you help me out here? Like, what constitutes as favorite? Like, can you explain to me how I can qualify a favorite game? And if they can't, then I do the thing that I tell them how I'm qualifying it. And hopefully that it narrows their line of thought, so that we can come to an agreement. So, for example, my classical approach would be the it depends route. Yeah. So you're every time you say it depends, you're abstract thinking. Like, so I'm not saying people are inherently bad at abstract thinking. You are looking for abstract thinking, but the thing is, you're only as abstract as all you know, right? But the nice thing about that is you are telling someone else, and their abstract thinking might be limited to what they know. So the it depends route is like the goal of it, and like how often you participate in it. But how can you use that as well? Like, one of my favorite exercises when playing video games and talking about discussions and stuff is, I don't want someone to tell me it depends. I want to challenge that person to explain to me how it doesn't depend on the like when you state the conditions. Like, I want you to practice, or like I want people to be able to practice educating me. The it depends route doesn't educate anyone. And unfortunately, it's the safe thing, you know, like the idea that you said, it probably correlates with a lot of nuances, and it would probably take a decade to draw some sort. I absolutely agree with you. And if you say depends, I absolutely agree with you. But what are you practicing when you say that? You're not practicing talking the talk, I can tell you that. And that's my whole like central theme of yesterday's digression. Like, talking the talk has become so underrated. So much. And it actually deals with everything we talked about today. Like wanting to know why feet and inches is important to know versus centimeters. Well, you have to talk to Americans at some point. I like to think. You can choose to never talk to an American. That would be a pragmatic solution to your problem. So that's an abstraction of why it's not worth. So when you tell, like, when I say things that are not worth, I have to qualify it. When I ask someone, like, they say, I dislike this game. Like, I just hate this game. Oh, yeah? Can you tell me why? And it would just stop there. The conversation would just stop there. It's like, well, I haven't really thought about it. I just don't like. And then at most you would have the things that are hard to abstractly describe. So they're like really abstract things, right? What's abstract? What's a abstract thing that people have poor time describing? Their feelings, or what turns them off. What, like, I mean, the whole hostess thing illustrates that. This is why I think it's not BS for dating sims and stuff. You actually get into the mind of how people are writing. Like, how do you write a compelling character? How do you not write a compelling character? Does it check out? Does it not? All those permutations keep your mind abstractly thinking about stuff, like possibilities. So in the end, we're having this discussion because whenever I think about a character that is being displayed and being written, I'm thinking about a writer, multiple writers writing this stuff and thinking about the same thing. Like, and it goes way, way back. Now let's just take it all the way back so we can wrap up this digression. It goes back to them choosing to say 177 centimeters versus, I don't know how many, I actually don't know how much 170 centimeter is in feet. 5.57? And then now we have to complete, that's like 7 inches? So it's like, see, you have to do 2 conversions, right? 170 into feet. So that's 5 feet. And then you have the remainder, which you have to convert to inches, which 5.58 feet is like 5 feet and 7 inches. Or something like that. I have no idea. I think that's close enough. So, like, I can't do any of that. It's, I mean, like, I can't do that, like, right off my bat. Does that make me bad at math? It kind of does. I mean, it really actually kind of does. I don't know. I could, yeah, this is where I can think of many counter arguments too. Right. But if I had to take a gamble, being able to convert units off the top of your head, it's an impressive show of mathematics. Understanding. It's not me. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just saying if you can make really fast mathematical conversions in your head, it can often give the impression that someone's good at math. I just don't. I honestly, if I had to be critical about myself, I have an under-practiced skill. And one of the under-practiced skill is remembering specific conversion units. Like, what I mean is, I don't know the universal gas constant anymore. I think I know Avogadro's number, 6.23 times 10 to the negative 23rd, or not negative 20, 10 to the 23rd. Like, I don't remember constants. And constants allow for conversions. So I don't remember any of those. And not because I'm trying to and I'm bad at it. I'm intentionally choosing not to remember constants at the exchange of understanding the concept of them. So, for example, here's a good sort of abstraction that demonstrates I'm actually kind of poor at math. I know feet is longer than centimeter. I know an inch is longer than a centimeter. That's it. That's how I get by. Like, I know relatives, and that relatives help me find the information that allows me to maybe garner a deduction. So, for example, if I meet a stranger and they told me 5 things. 4 of those things is about them out of 5. That relatively speaks to me that they're concerned about themselves. How? In what nature? That's next level. Okay? Out of the 4 things about themselves, 2 of them are negative and 2 of them are neutral. So overall, they have a negative opinion about whatever they're expressing about themselves. So I could deduce with high likelihood that they're trying to get a positive feeling from me at some point, like some sort of positive feedback. Like they're looking for something to balance that. But it doesn't guarantee that I'm correct about the deduction. Much like inches, centimeters, and feet. So I can tell if someone tells me, like, we talk in relatives. So when someone said 100 centimeters, it's like, man, that's kind of tall. I'm like, well, if I don't know what 107 centimeters are, I know that inches and feet are bigger. So their numbers are smaller, right? And then what I do is I relatively think. And usually you get by with that. And I consciously make this decision not to remember constants. And I think remembering like constants is also a way to demonstrate you're good at math. Like how many inches are in a feet, how many centimeters are. It's often dealing with memorization, which is kind of it's kind of weird. Sometimes being smart in general deals with memory. I think some of the most intelligent people in the world are easily the most charismatic. But how do you ever equate charisma with smart people? Like here's a very deep cut. Generally speaking, the type of smart people the properties that we value as smart people, those individuals do not practice a skill like conversationalism. They inherently don't have time for that, right? So when you think about what does a smart person look like, describe a smart person, that's such a great exercise. Like if I was a cloud, like if I had a big community, like say like 50,000 people or something, my first social experiment would be just to have everyone describe certain things. Like, tell me why it's weird that she said 107 centimeters in this situation. Actually, that's too specific. I just said weird. Tell me what your initial impressions are by this scenario, and I would be so engrossed, and I would love to see what that response is. And I think your response is great, and that's why we had this huge, gigantic conversation. It's so interesting to talk about these, and that's what video games do to me personally. Like if a video game can elicit that in people not like me, I think they hit a home run. That's what makes abstraction worth a lot. So a video game is an abstraction, by the way, because it's a creative process. The product that they made is creative, is an abstraction of reality. There are some asterisks, like you could say, if someone's recreating a city, you might be thinking like, oh, but what if they just reproduce real life? That's still an abstraction. They have to figure out how to reproduce the thing digitally. So this is a great example. Like, so how valuable is the abstraction? Well, it's only as valuable as you can find value in it. And to me, if someone can find something interesting about the most, you could say debatably, the most smallest details, I have no reservations that that person will be fine. Unless they experience mania. I think that's one of the bigger asterisks, but it's so extreme. Like, I rarely do I feel that I connect to a lot of people, even at a university or something, where they can truly understand when I say you're thinking too much and it drives you insane. Like it makes you very depressed. I don't think I met someone like that too often, and it might be also that someone like that would probably not express that. Like, I wouldn't openly and go around and say like, you just said something, please, you gotta pause for 15 minutes because what you just said, I have so many thoughts, can you just pause for 15 minutes? That's kind of how I feel a lot of times. Like, and I don't necessarily think where people are on the same page when I think of that. Before, just a little bit slight story about the cons of being someone like me. I don't know how many are there, or like, I don't know if I'm special or not. I can't, I have no data on this. But when I was younger, when someone spoke something and they said it, like they said, oh yeah, you know, drinking sucks. And immediately I have like a lot of mania, right? It's just a lot of mania. I haven't drank before. Like, when I was younger, I haven't drank alcohol before. But then, you know, all these other things, it's like, why does this person say drinking sucks? It's like, hold on. But the person just keeps going, right? The person is just like, oh yeah, we're moving on because we don't think much of it. Like, it's a common accepted thing. It's like, hold on, just, and then eventually I get aggravated. Like, as a kid, I just be like, I haven't heard the next like 8 billion words just said. Like, I couldn't even process how non-specific your comment was. How could you just make that comment? So what happens is I have a temper. And what I do when I was a kid was I bottle it up. I basically never asked someone to just slow down. And instead, I blow up every once in a while. So like, when I get too many stimuli every once in a while, I was unable to keep it in, and I just break at someone. And it's usually like shouting, raising my voice and whatnot, or get angry with myself or something like that. It happens a lot. But the remedy to that, in my opinion, the thing that I rely on is I just gotta learn more. Just learn more. Learn more so that it satisfies my need to feel competent enough. Because generally speaking, I'm not angry that someone else is incompetent. I'm angry that I am not competent enough to understand why that person's incompetent. Does that sound really weird? No, I think that, yeah, that's right. So, when someone tells me that the comment, this goes back to an earlier Twitch situation. Someone accused me of caring about being right. And my first response to that is, what does that have to do with why I'm angry right now? I didn't say that. My first process is like, oh yeah, well, I guess it might seem like I'm fishing for explanation, but the thing is, I really wanted that person to keep adding. So like this person was saying something, right? They said, I don't know, male streamers are all simps or something like that. I don't know. I'm not. It's something like really egregious, like something that is very. But my goal was like, oh yeah, you know what? Let's try to explain that. Like, how do you know? Like, can you explain that to me? And this person immediately said like, well, I don't know. Like, it's just a feeling. Like, you know, my experience tells me that. It's like, okay, can you explain these experiences? And then I went on, it's like, oh, can you also like say this and this? And then all the while I'm thinking to myself, well, it just sounds like I need to be proven. Like I'm challenging them. They're getting defensive because they think that I'm suspicious, when genuinely I just want to know how they got to it. Because then if I know that, I don't need to know that anymore. I can use that. So in the future, when I bump into someone who says the exact same thing, I don't have to feel so insecure anymore. I don't have to feel like I don't understand or I'm out of the loop. And that summarizes everything. So for me, yes, I should know how much is in 170 centimeters in inches and feet. Because one day I'm gonna bump into somebody and say, man, is that tall or short? And then I'm gonna say, it's tall, obviously, and then I'm gonna be stricken with confusion because I would have forgotten like, oh wait, what is tall in feet and inches? And then what would happen is I would go through a cycle of feeling uncomfortable, feeling incompetent, and no, it's not because that person made an incompetent statement. It's because I just couldn't understand that incompetence. Even if I even think it's incompetent, it feels like I have the responsibility, in my opinion, and it's like grandstanding, it's selfish, it's a little bit narcissistic too, but it's my personality that I cope with all the time. And that's the idea that I want to understand it so that I don't have to be frustrated. But it comes off as often it comes off as that person not willing to explain it because they're not well practiced at it. That's where my focus is. For this digression, the previous digression, it's take 2 of walking the walk and talking the talk. In my happy little bubble, in my ideal world, I want to spend, this sounds so like grandiose, but I'm probably going to spend the rest of my life knowing people and trying my best to get those people to talk the talk more efficiently. Like, I love that I can see them do all these things. The people that I meet, the people that have life experiences, they've done the walking. Like, you've walked, you've gotten the experience. How can you share that with me if I want to do it? Like, how can you? Like, you can't just like fly. Well, you technically can, I guess. You could like fly across the world or find me out and then we do it literally. It's like, okay, that's fair. But in this day and age, we're connected by technology. I hope technology comes up with a solution. That'd be kind of cool, like VR or like tactility, or whatever. I'm like spiraling, but it's so great that in the future, I hope that everyone just spent so much time communicating, like relying on communicating, that one day that would be the goat to circumventing misunderstanding. It would make humans circumvent the one thing that's kind of really deficient right now, and that's overcoming misunderstanding or communicating in a way that is normalized to not cultures, not like personal experiences, but just an idea, a really well practiced way of basically troubleshooting communication. When your mind starts to wander around, branching out into everything, I solve it by talking out loud through an imaginary scenario that emphasizes that. So it really is very easy for me to manage because talking through things out loud generally consumes way too much energy for me. The con is the next step is a shutdown. Still not exactly sure what you feel with mania. I don't know if it's similar. Yeah. Yes. It's close. I think that's more or less what happens. Talking out loud is a great way. Nowadays, I also write. I write a lot. Like I write in my head, I write figuratively, I write literally, I organize. So I continue to organize and over time, it takes up less and less energy to organize. So, when I was younger, it took up too much energy. So it just keeps taking up more energy. And it's to the point where what you do is you shut down. You shut out the world. You shut out, you block as much of it out as possible. So a very classical way for a kid who doesn't understand how to manage stress yet is listen to really, really loud music to the point it overwhelms your senses, right? Or express a form of anger that blocks everything else out. A lot of times you get the kids to like play sports or something, like run until you're really tired, or things that just completely supersedes how you can't take it anymore. Like you can't contain the mania, and mania is crippling. And I think the only difference between someone who's overwhelmed, someone who's like stress, like typical stress that's manageable, or like what I mean by typical stress is manageable stress, and mania is that mania is crippling. Mania is the point where you stop getting up. You stay in bed because there's too many thoughts. Like it just doesn't matter. Like I don't want to deal with this. Life, with the moment you wake up, all you worry, you could also have mania in the form of a panic attack. So when like your heart just raced all of a sudden and you can't catch your breath and you collapse. That's type of mania. It can be very symptomatic and incredibly crippling. Luckily for me, I don't experience mania too much. I honestly think that all I can call them now are what did I call them? Thought storms. I used to wear thought storms. They last like I had one yesterday, and that lasted about like 6 hours. So basically I didn't do anything but think about that one thing for 6 hours. Like it's just I didn't do anything. I just thought about it for 6 hours. I didn't eat. I didn't go to bath. I just, you know, that it consumed you. So that's kind of what I'm describing. It's just a really extreme thing, but I don't throw that word around loosely. But yes, talking out loud, organizing your thoughts, writing it down, playing a video game that's related to it, that's kind of therapeutic. You're basically, I don't want to use the word distract. You can choose to distract from it, but you can also actively harness it. So, I'm killing with 2 birds with 1 stone because I'm converting that mania. Thanks. I'm typically converting the mania into something that's productive. Or what I mean by productive is something I find productive. So, if I have mania, I have ideas. And if I have ideas, I want to write them down. And when I write them down, I could use them later. And when I build on those ideas, the mania subsides. So what I mean is, if I'm having a thought storm now, I'll write most of the ideas down. And then when it happens again, I'll know more of all the ideas. So I will, in theory, I don't know it's always true. Sometimes it just leads to more questions and the mania gets worse. But overall, for me, when I write all those ideas down and I pursue all those ideas, the next time the trigger happens, I'm rehearsed. I've learned those ideas and I'm no longer concerned with them. Like for today, I'm going to think about whether I should review or get relative measures of length. Because I truly don't really know if 170 centimeters is tall or not. To me, it's my height. It's around my height. 170 is, it's like, I'm like 174 centimeters. So is that tall or not? Well, how do I qualify what is tall? Well, whatever is tall is taller than me. So in this case, no. So if I state that, so now I have to like remember, maybe I should learn what I am in height, right? Well, it doesn't depend anymore because I already told you what it depends on, right? Worm? Like I literally just told you what it depends on. My definition of tall depends on how tall I am. And I'm greater than 170. So now we're gonna qualify that I'm telling you I'm 174 centimeters. So if it is shorter than me, it is considered short. If it's taller than me, then it's considered tall, right? If the object or person, and then when you evaluate, you have to remember that I am 174 centimeters. And all you have to do is compare to that standard. And it no longer depends on anything. Or it no longer depends on, like, depends. It depends on my height. And that's it. But then you have to ask yourself, well, now it's only relevant to this situation. Is it worth remembering that? Right? We have to go back to, like, is it worth remembering how tall I am? Well, for myself, starting today, I might consider that. It would be relatively informative to know your relative height, because then you can use it as a metric to understand what's tall or what's not. And you can say things like, I'm the moment 170 centimeter comes up, it's like, I'm 174. So I'm going to tell you now, it's not dependent on how tall you are. I'm 174, 170 is shorter than me. It's not tall. And that would be helpful. Do I want to remember it? I don't know. But the one thing is being able to express my height in centimeters is useful. That I can see. But if it's not useful, can I make it useful? Like, is there a reason I should? Well, one thing is I know people who use centimeters. So I think that's a sufficient reason to know it. 5 feet 8 inches. Yeah, 5 feet 8 inches is what I'm thinking of. That's my height, right, in the English units. And then you add 60 to 8 inches, right? Or am I doing that incorrectly? Is there 12 inches in a foot? Anyways, we're done digressing today. Let's wrap up like what the theme is. The central theme of what I'm saying in all of this is that there are things we choose not to know, and there are things that we choose to know. And you can say it depends on a lot of things, but the highest form of depends is the value system. So if you can convince yourself that there's a value to it, it doesn't depend on anything after it. And that value doesn't have to depend on something you know now. And then we'll wrap it up by relating it back to abstract thinking. Abstract thinking helps you with that, developing that motivation. And all of that goes back to yesterday's talk about talking the talk and walking the walk. Your experiences and intuition provides a lot of shortcuts. But we have to remember that those are shortcuts. Intellectually, shortcuts make one less intellectually inclined. Like, you are taking shortcuts. It's the efficient way to go about it. It's working smart, not hard. But when you work hard, you don't know if it's worth it, because you haven't seen the fruits of your labor yet, right? So if you're constantly doing something 100 times, do you know the value of doing the 100 times, or just the last time you did it? It's difficult to quantify. So to me, I would say, for my hot take, ask yourself if you can explain why you think something is the way it is to another person, then I think you probably are really, you've thought about it enough. That's all I can say. Like, it's so generic, but what I can say is the hot take is, the next time you think something is weird, or you have thought about something, I would love to hear how you explain that. It doesn't matter what that means, how that does. I think it's a great exercise most people don't do anymore, because they get the answer right away. It's like, oh, hey, it feels weird. That's as much you're going to think about it. That's it. No explanations, no necessary. And it doesn't depends, because you've already have the solution to, like, in your head. You've already come to that conclusion somehow. All right. We're going to finish this last segment and then go back to Dragon. Yakuza Like a Dragon. That was a bit of... It got really rambly because it's something I've been thinking about, but not something really well thought out yet.